Hey friends, I'm Sabrina, the rookie around here. John and Dick are the old school American fans of F1. Thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation we had about the 2023 Hungarian Grand Prix. 12 in a row for Red Bull. Danny Rick is back. The midfield is more jumbled than ever. I needed the guys to help me analyze this race. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Gentlemen, the Hungarian Grand Prix. It was an interesting, actually, I'm not telling the truth. I should tell the audience how I really felt. I thought this race was a snooze fest. I don't know. Maybe you guys had a different opinion, John, Dick, before I ask any of the other questions. Yay, nay, did you agree with me?
Well, I think the better way to say that, Sabrina, is that it's not the most dynamic race on the schedule.
Oh, okay. You're being so gracious and I'm being a little harsh. Okay.
And my dog went fast asleep watching it with me.
Well, I'm a dog lover, so I feel
go.
good that at least your dog and I had the same.
Had a good nap.
Yeah, we had a very good Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning nap. Let's see how you guys can maybe change my mind when it comes to this race, because I do know it's important to give each race its own analysis and also to see its value as a part of the calendar. So let's look at free practice. Do we want to talk about that? Yay, nay?
No.
Yeah, free practice 1 and 2, they were pretty meaningless because of the weather.
Okay. So then what about quali?
Well, I think first of all, you just have to give a shout out to Lewis. He took a car that really was inferior and he put it on pole. Now it was 3 thousandths of a second faster than Verstappen, but 3 thousandths is faster than Max's time. And it was really a spectacular performance, I thought, by Lewis. And it shows, I think, as much as anything, that he's regained confidence in the car and he's able to really wring it out a bit. That was a big performance on his part.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if you think about the level of performance that he was performing at, to get that car to out-qualify Max in a Red Bull makes you wonder what Lewis would have done if he was in a Red Bull and comfortable with that car. You got to think that he would have smoked Max. I realize there's a lot of Max fans that may not like me for saying that, but you kind of got to wonder. Probably the other thing that I would talk about too is that the field, and it's a short track and it's a tight track and all that kind of stuff, but the field was pretty tight. If you go and you look at it, the top 8, I think, were separated by like 0.4 of a second, which in Grand Prix terms is a really, really tight track. Thought that was pretty interesting too. Of course, the end result didn't look anything like that, but qualifying certainly was pointing towards a much more competitive race.
Well, so then moving on to the actual Grand Prix race, who caught your eye, driver or team? John, I'll go with you first.
I'm happy to say that Logan Sargent caught my eye. In the race, when you look at fastest laps, his fastest lap was faster than Albon. That's an accomplishment. Hats off to him and good for America. I did think that the most impressive driver on the day-to-day, other than maybe the driver of the day, but Oscar Piastri is just an amazing driver. And he is, we have to remember, this is his first season in Formula One, and he is just performing to a very high standard. And I'm very impressed with his work. Mm-hmm. And today was equally good. He showed great maturity and real fight.
Yeah, I was also impressed by him, both at Silverstone, as we discussed during that race debrief, and then this race. I just kept thinking he's the slow burn. He didn't, some people come in and they really make a big splash, but I feel like he's been very calculating in how he's trying to acclimate himself to the grid. And I thought that showed, as you said, maturity. And I think probably really good counsel around him of just keep on doing and adjusting. And it seems like that works well with where McLaren is, which, Dick, I wondered what your thoughts were about who caught your eye and either driver or team.
Well, I think, in the case of McLaren, we saw them look really strong at Silverstone and we said, well, is that track specific? And of course, McLaren themselves were coming out and saying, yeah, we were good at Silverstone, but, we're really not expecting to do all that great at the Hungaroring. Well, they did do well. It tends to make you think that at least at this moment, maybe they've got the second best car out there. The other piece is kind of going back to what John's talking about, but the way Oscar is driving, there's a couple of pretty solid drivers that are going to be able to take it to the likes of Aston Martin, certainly maybe even Ferrari, because it's two different scenarios. I think Oscar may be more solid than Lance Stroll. Okay, so you've got that one to consider. But then in the other case, with McLaren. McLaren clearly has a better car than Ferrari, and they have two solid drivers like Ferrari has. I mean, let's face it, Ferrari's guys are really, really good. And I think we're starting to see that McLaren has two really, really good guys as well. If Ferrari is unable to get more pace out of their car, I think McLaren's going to be knocking on their door very quickly. You know, the other side of that story is that Aston Martin's falling like a stone. I mean, they're just not keeping up with the development pace, which goes back to a comment that John made 2 or 3 episodes ago where he said, hey, Aston Martin's has to learn, and they're still, let's face it, they're still kind of a new team. They're having to learn how to really manage a full season. You know, it's one thing to go out and manage a handful of races and do really, really well, but how do you keep that momentum going for a full season? And so this is something that they're just having to learn. And Alonso is going to help them get there. And a lot of the very experienced people that they have are going to help them to get there. But their lack of a modern factory, their lack of their own wind tunnel, those kinds of things is really starting to show.
When we talk about McLaren, I can't help but think about a returnee to the grid who's a former McLaren driver. And I wondered what you guys thought about that.
John, I'll punt and let you talk about Danny.
All right. Well, happy to. Everybody was happy to see Danny Rick back. And honestly, I mean, I saw a photograph of him on the plane going over, and you could barely see anything but his teeth, smiling so big. So he's clearly happy to be back. I think the paddock is happy to have him back. He's such a fun guy. But man, if you worry about Nick DeVries being dismissed, I think other than Honda being a strong Tsunoda supporter, he's in trouble because first time in the car after 6 months out of the car, Danny comes back and he out-qualifies Tsunoda. And then he got punted in the first turn, kicked to the back, and comes through and outraced Tsunoda. So that's a huge, huge performance by Ricardo in his first time back. So hats off to him. Good day, mate, and well done. But what you had one, Dick? What was your?
Well, mine was Sergio. I was really, really glad to see Sergio make it into Q3. It was his first time in like 5 races or something like that he made it into Q3. And while he didn't qualify like Max did, he put in a great drive. And I thought it was a very solid performance. And Christian Horner called him out and said, hey, this was a statement drive by Sergio. And he said, it's very clear that Sergio is saying, don't write me off yet. I was glad. I hope Christian is sincere about what he's saying there, because I think Sergio has proven many, many times that he is a worthy number 2 to Max. But there, at the same time, certainly he's had a run of really, really difficult races. Certainly in his battle to finish second in the points to Max, this did nothing but help his cause. Hats off to him.
Well, I think one thing to say about Sergio is that as tough as his performance has been in terms of the last 5 races, he really is the only driver who's ever beaten Max on any kind of level stage. And even though he's come under a lot of criticism and his performance has not been what it needed to be, he's still the only guy who's really outperformed Max in the same car.
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think especially if we do tie it to all this discussion about Danny Rick and him coming back, keeping that in the back of our mind as to the evaluation of Sergio and his continued place inside the Red Bull team. Well, so then what, if any, psychological warfare did you see on or off the track?
Oh, I thought that this was hilarious. To me, we've now gone, instead of negative, I'll describe this as negative psychological warfare. This is now aggressive psychological warfare. They're now into defensive and passive psychological warfare. Everybody's talking about how good the other guy's car are. What do you think about that, Dick?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things where, I'm going to go and say, oh yeah, so-and-so's got the best car or he's got the best engine. But hey, look, I beat him.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah. It's all, number one, downplaying the opposition, downplaying what you have to work with and talking up how great you are. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. It's great stuff.
And I don't think that that's as intuitive to those of us who are newer to the sport, but especially you guys as racers know that strength. So that's really something I'm glad you point out. Okay, so then let's look at some of the official calls that were made. There weren't a ton, but there were some that occurred that I think had some impact. John, what are your thoughts on that on that question?
Well, first of all, I thought that Joe got off very, very light with his penalty because he took out both the Alpines in turn one and put Danny Rick back at the very back. So he got, I think, a 5-second penalty. That was nothing compared to the damage that he did. And you got to think, if Alpine is sitting there with corporate breathing down their neck for results, nobody's happy in that camp this weekend. I mean, that was a pretty violent accident. Did you think, Dick?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you kind of got to wonder about it. You bring up a point and, you know, and I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole, but I'm going to start digging one and we can talk about it later. You know, with the way things are going at Alpine, and I don't know if you saw, but Laurent Rossi, the CEO of Alpine, is no longer over the team, which I think is really a very good move, because I don't think that guy's a very good leader, but that's just me. But, you know, you think about it, if Alpine doesn't get it together, it could very well be that somebody would come along and buy Alpine, just, you know, just like you go out and buy Williams. But this time it's just sort of like Alpine is sort of like, yeah, we're done. You know, maybe we'll make engines, but we're not gonna run a team anymore. We're done.
Well, and the other side of that story, Dick, if I can interrupt you, is that Alpine is a nationalized car company. And so the French taxpayer has got a stake in this, you know, in a very real way.
Yeah.
This has got huge political overtones for the French government.
Sure.
Politicians.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, certainly, you know, we know that Ryan Reynolds and his group came in and purchased a stake in it. But I think if I'm like Otmar, I'm sitting there and I'm kind of going, how much longer do I want to be with these guys before my reputation starts getting destroyed?
Right. There's a real risk there for him, I'd say.
I think so too.
That's an interesting thought. I really hadn't considered that. I just kept thinking they need the track time, they need the data. But that's an interesting thought, that someone would come in and purchase. And then especially, as you said, John, the stake of the national ownership aspect of it. Thank you for highlighting that. I would not have thought of that. Okay, so let me ask you this. A lot of discussion for this race went on like the Pirelli tires and quali format and all these different things that were affecting the race that were related to tires. So I wondered what you had thoughts when it comes to tire strategy at this race. Dick, I'll throw it to you first.
Sure. I mean, you know, let's start kind of at the beginning. You know, we had this experimental qualification format where they said, hey, everybody in Q1 has to run the hard tires, everybody in Q2 on the mediums, and then Q3 be on the softs. This was something that they thought that they would try as part of, hey, what could this look like for 2024? The other piece is that, hey, instead of getting 13 sets of tires allocated to each car for the weekend, they were getting 11. In my mind, they should have tried this at some sort of a test that teams are all invited to go and participate in, where it's not a race that's open for the world championship, and let everybody kind of, you know, sort these things out, kind of out of the glare of the public spotlight, so to speak. And I'm not really sure why they chose to do it that way, because there is a certain level political points that could be scored, because 13 sets of tires per car versus 11 sets of tires, you're saving a whole, you know, whatever that is, 50 something tires for a weekend. 40 sets of tires. So there's something that Formula One can point to about sustainability and all that. I would argue that it doesn't really matter because it is such a small sample compared to all the tires being produced in the world. I don't think 40 sets is going to move the needle. But on the other hand, it was something different. And I will give props to F1 for trying something different. I just think they should have done it in a testing environment instead of, again, on a weekend where points are on line and that sort of thing. The other piece was the overall strategy around tires was really kind of like a non-starter to begin with. And the reason I say that is that, you know, you had a soft, a soft, a medium, and a hard. Well, what's interesting is the soft is the genuine Pirelli C5 soft tire. The the hard was the C3. And what was interesting about that is that C3 tire is the same compound that was last year's medium. So you really were running a soft, a medium, and a medium. And everybody opted to go what they called medium hard on their tire choices because of the temperature. So we never really saw the softs being put to use that much other than in quality. And I think a few people went to softs during the race, but at the end of the day, they were really choosing between mediums, new mediums, and old mediums.
Yeah, it just really didn't seem to make much difference, did it?
Nah, it really didn't. And that's not something we normally would say about a race.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, I know going back to one of your points that you made earlier about the whole question of sustainability, I think this would be something I'd be interested to hear from our listeners if this is something that they would like to hear us discuss more, if they have views about sustainability and how that vectors with the world of F1 and or has a view that they'd like to share with us. Let's talk about what we can glean about ongoing development. John, I'm going to throw it to you. Is there anything we can glean from this race on that question of development?
I'm not sure a lot can be taken from this race. I think that for the most part, what we're going to see going forward is changes or development of the setup of the cars as the teams work to really refine how well they understand how the car works. That's one thing. The other thing I think we may see is the beginning of, if there are parts that come onto the car, they're probably going to be parts that they're thinking about for next year as they start focusing on that. Dick, what do you think about development?
First of all, I think a couple things, and then I want to circle back to something that you said, John, about setup. Clearly, Aston Martin is losing the development war. We've kind of talked about this. They kept saying, oh, yeah, we're going to bring out an upgrade kit and it's going to put us on par with Red Bull and blah, blah, blah. Well, the upgrade kit never showed up. They brought out a rear wing at Azerbaijan to try to narrow the gap, the DRS gap advantage that Red Bull has over everybody. And I think that was probably partially successful because I believe that wing is still on the car. For Silverstone, they brought out a front wing that was specific to Silverstone, but, Silverstone is so different from Hungary. It doesn't really matter. It's not good. They would never have used it at the Hungaroring for sure. Again, and we've kind of talked about this. I mean, we're seeing this, that Aston Martin showed up for the first race with a really, really good car, and they took advantage of it. But then they're losing the development battle, and they're starting to slide down the grid. And I would say that given where McLaren came from, what they're looking like, if they keep this up, I think Aston Martin is in big trouble. I think Ferrari's in big trouble. And Mercedes, it could get really, really interesting between McLaren and Mercedes as we get towards the end of the year, trying to nail down who's going to finish second. I don't want to count my boy Fernando Alonso out, but unless they come up with a development package that comes in like right after the break and it works, that's the other part. It's one thing to bring new bits, but they got to work. I think Aston Martin is going to be, they started out fast and then they kind of had a slow death. The other piece that was really interesting is that I kind of wonder about where Alfa Romeo came from, because they really haven't looked that great this year, but certainly in qualifying, they look pretty darn strong. Now in the race, they kind of flattered to deceive a little bit, but there were some extenuating circumstances on that too. Did they find something, or was just that the car, again, when we've talked about this before, it's possible to have a car that just suits a particular track, and maybe that was it. Obviously Bottas has not forgotten how to drive, and Joe, I think the guy probably has more talent than maybe we give him credit for. He's been able to kind of develop under the radar because Alfa Romeo, they're not a front running team, so he's kind of a little bit out of the spotlight, so to speak. My last point that I'd make, and this is just me speaking from experience, and John, I don't know how much time that you spent either developing or driving a ground effect car, but I've actually been able to do it with the Formula Atlantic cars. And in fact, I've engineered a Formula Atlantic car which on that particular car, it was the Ralt RT5. So we're talking a long time ago. It was legal to run skirts on these cars. The point that I want to make is that ride height and pitch and roll sensitivity on a ground effects car, which is what we're talking about here, is massively critical. You have got to have an aerodynamic platform that is absolutely as rock solid, unchanging as possible. And so going back to John's point, the experimentation confusion around getting that platform to stay in the same plane as the racetrack, going over bumps, going into corners in the chassis, rolling on the suspension and all that kind of stuff. All of that changes the aerodynamic center of pressure, and it also increases and decreases aerodynamic load as the car moves around, reacting to corners and bumps. That is a massive, massive challenge. And part of the reason that the Red Bull is so good is that Adrian Newey has been chasing solutions to this since the early 1990s when he came out with that reactive suspension for Williams. And so my guess is that the aerodynamic platform on the Red Bull is incredibly stable, and all the other teams are trying to figure out how on earth the Red Bull is actually doing it. Because I think you can take all the pictures you want of their wings and floor and all that kind of stuff, and that's part of the story. But the real story is what's going on inside of those shocks in the shock absorbers or the dampers in that Red Bull that's keeping that car so steady on that platform. I don't know, John. I mean, that's my take.
Well, I did do a test day in an RT5, and I can tell you that you're right. When those things are working with the skirts and everything, it changes your world.
You're right.
Right. But I did see a comment this week from Lewis in which he kind of gave away a little bit of what they're looking at the factory, I think. And he was talking about, I'm gathering that he was talking about computational fluid dynamics, or CFD, and the engineers looking at the vortices underneath the car from all of the bits and pieces that they have on the under tray.
Right.
And so you're right, and so on point, that understanding that is just key, both to the engineers making the car work better and for the driver to have the confidence to really take it and get the most out of it.
Yep.
Because as you well know, if you did development, I didn't do any development work. I only drove one of the things. But when that stuff goes wrong, it takes your confidence completely away for a long, long time.
I think a couple of parting shots on this. The first is as a driver, and you would know this, John. The way a ground effects car is, faster the air moves both under and over the car, the more downforce you get created. I mean, then there's a difference in the speeds, right? It's moving faster underneath than it is on top. But the dichotomy is that you think you're at the limit, and then you actually can go into a corner even faster, knowing that because I'm going into the corner, I don't know, 5 miles an hour faster, I'm producing just that much more downforce that's going to allow me to continue to stick in the corner. So the driver has to change his brain about how the car works, that you literally can go carry more speed into the corner than you think is possible, and you get away with it because by going faster, you're actually creating more downforce. So that's the first point. That's the driving side of it. But the other question is, the other piece that is interesting is if you look at a lot of airplanes, they have what's called vortex generators being put on the wing of the airplane, and they look like what a race car designer would call shark's teeth. And they go on top of the wing, which on an airplane, you're trying to create lift. Well, when they do that, depending on the airplane, you can add hundreds of pounds of useful load. In other words, carrying ability, fuel, passengers, whatever. You can do that by putting those vortex generators on the car. Well, guess what? Formula One car is no different. It's just that they're putting them underneath the car. And that goes back to Lewis saying, oh yeah, we're studying the vortices that are being generated underneath the car. And if you go and you look at the leading edge of the floor, they're playing around with those things all over the place. And it's all about getting the center of pressure just in the right place and creating the right kind of vortices to increase the amount of downforce in this case.
Well, one other comment on that too, Dick, and that's a great explanation of how they're working these things. Do you think that the downforce that's generated changes depending on the track characteristics from track to track?
It has to. In my opinion, it's going to have to change if the temperature goes up.
Oh yeah, absolutely, because the density of the air changes with temperature.
Exactly. I mean, think about it this way. Certainly a friendly acquaintance with a very well-known race engineer named Jeff Braun. Jeff has engineered cars at Daytona and Le Mans and Indianapolis and all that. And he told me one time that a ride height change at Indianapolis, again, a ground effect car traveling at a really high rate of speed, thousandths of an inch change in ride height up or down, and the driver can feel it. That's staggering.
That is staggering. Yeah. And I do believe it.
Yep. I'm done about ground effect cars, but I mean, they're fascinating. They're fascinating cars.
We've exhausted Dick's vocabulary.
Well, yeah, whatever is left of my little tiny brain, it's gone.
I think that discussion helps for those of us who aren't racers and who aren't really early engineers to have a better understanding, especially when you explained it when it comes to the airplane, was really helpful. Okay, let me move on to the next question that I have, which is kind of based off of the development discussion is, well, what data does this race provide us when it comes to the championship itself, constructor or driver? Dick, I'll hand that off to you.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we don't really have any doubts of who's going to win the drivers' championship or the constructors' championship this year. However, from about P2 to P4, maybe P5, something like that, the battle to me is incredibly murky and muddy because suddenly McLaren is sitting there, like I said before, I think they're going to leapfrog Aston Martin if Aston Martin decides to stay put and start focusing on the 2024 car. I think they could leapfrog Ferrari because Ferrari finds new ways to lose all the time, like wheel guns that don't suddenly work for some reason. And I think
that was a little poke at me, wasn't it? Just a little. I know. Just a little bit. Totally fine. I'm totally happy.
But you know what? I'm starting to feel sorry for Charles.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because the guy is driving his rear end off and his team just constantly just shoots themselves in the foot. It's just, if it wasn't so tragic, it'd be hilarious. But I think McLaren legit could finish third. And if they execute, that's a big if they execute, I think that they're going to make Mercedes sweat. That's my prediction.
How exciting is that to have McLaren, a real iconic team? You know, next thing we know, Williams is going to be back in the hunt.
Yeah. And that's not such a crazy statement. You can kind of feel that Williams is getting some momentum.
I think that it would be very exciting either at Spa next week or we come back after the summer break and start to see things start to reorder yet again. Like you said, the championship, nobody's questioning. Max had 30 seconds or more on Lando. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I'm just not watching that part of the race anymore. The part that I was awake for, right? And and it was lap 60 when I fell asleep between 50 and 60. And I woke up because I was thinking, if anything's going to happen, it's going to happen at 60. Did it? No. But what I did think was interesting is the rest of the field, as you said. And I got to say, I was really impressed for Red Bull 12 in a row.
Yes.
That's a cool thing. Having that history moment with all the other stuff that I sound a little bitter. I'm not bitter. I appreciate what they are doing. I really do want anybody listening to realize that I'm not like some person
if you look at it, you know, that's a very, very hard thing to do in Formula One, to win 12 in a row. It's only been done, I think, 3 times?
The record was, the last time it was done was McLaren. I mean, think about who was driving. Senna and Prost.
Yeah.
And here's Red Bull, and they've got, Verstappen and Perez. And at this stage, nobody is talking about Max or Sergio in the same breath as Ayrton and Elaine.
Yeah.
Can you remind me, because I can't remember my history right now, Adrian Newey was at McLaren before, right?
Yes, but that was in the 2000s.
Okay.
I want to say John Barnhart designed the 1988 McLaren.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
I think I've been thinking about Newey and his skill set a lot since we saw the Canadian Grand Prix and he stood up there. And I think most of our listeners know I was really impressed by his humility when we were debriefing that race, right? And just to have someone of that prowess of intellectual capability and developing their skill and their craft, and then now to see it translate onto the grid and to create such a car, and now to hear, I guess it came back into my mind listening to you, Dick, talk about what you did about the ongoing development and how Newey has been integral. So that's where I do give them applause and say, as much as I'm tired of hearing the Austrian and Dutch anthem every race, it's well deserved. And that is part of being in sport, is honoring the person who, or the team or the group that is winning, even when you're not, because that's sportsmanship, and also acknowledging skill. And so I think that's where, when I look at 12 in a row and see what they're achieving, and I think it maybe makes it a little bit easier for me as well, because I do see that maturity inside of Max that maybe a year ago we didn't see. And it seems like he's more settled. It doesn't feel so, I know he's fiercely fighting, right? And he is doing an excellent job, and there is skill that he has built, but it doesn't feel so dramatic. It feels very settled. And so when you talk about Senna and other iconic names, and that his is now starting to join into that group, I think that there is value, as much as I will always be a Charles fangirl. And I do think he needs to get into the right team. I just don't know where else he could go. But here's the thing, I do think the midfield being as jumbled, and as you noted, McLaren and Mercedes, I'm like, there's a lot of options for a good driver. If a seat comes open, you could go in and really bring a challenge in, because what we're seeing is that the teams are doing better with their development efforts, and hopefully they're taking some of the stuff that they're learning from this year into 2024, as John said.
I just reiterate thoughts that I've expressed before, and that is that it's not the most exciting thing when Max is just constantly running away from everybody else, but it's a really special era. It's really something to see. And we, especially new fans, just need to remember and focus on how rare this is when a driver just flat runs away from everybody else. It just doesn't happen all that often when you have the best driver in the best car for a period where the other guys just can't catch up with them, because there's some really, really smart people engineering and building these cars on the other teams, and there's some really, really good drivers driving the other cars. It's noteworthy to just remember a little bit, and to find some appreciation in the fact that Max is really an incredible driver. He's not going to be there forever. The Red Bull car right now is a really incredible car, and it's not going to be at the head of things every year from here on in either. So we should enjoy that and go back into the rest of the field and see how good the racing is in between first and last. It's really exciting to see.
Yeah, I mean, Alonso made a comment the other day. He said, whatever team finishes last in the Constructors' Championship in 2023 is going to be better than the Renault team that I drove for in 2005, 2006 to win the World Championship.
Interesting comment.
Yep.
John, I felt like that was a little bit of a counseling session for me, so appreciate that. But when we look at the race, I think it's interesting that, as you said, the last places, it's not like the last places of just a few years ago, where a lot of it was more people who were crashing the car and not able to skillfully drive the car. But here, the times between the teams are so close, which I think proves to the point of what you're saying. I hope that people will realize what you said is really the way we should look at this era, is that if we stick with the sport, and it's not just a thing that we just casually pick up one year and then come back or leave because it's not as cool as the year before. But the more time you have in the sport, the more you can see these ups and downs, and you can get these principles out of here and watch this race of development and discipline and all the different things that come out of the world of F1, especially for Americans who are newer to the sport, who don't have that longevity like you guys do. So I think that's one of the things I hope any of our listeners who are trying to hold steady, that maybe you came in during a period of drama and what seemed like a nail biter every race, that there is value to this. And that, as John, you noted, we don't get this type of driver who just runs away, but that's also really cool to be a witness to. Okay, so last question, Dick, any notable facts about the track you want to share?
Two things that came out this weekend: that there's been a 10-year extension for this particular race, which, judging by the number of spectators that were there, oh my goodness, that was a very, very well attended event. So I hope they keep going in terms of attendance. It's got to be great for Hungary in general, but Budapest in particular. I thought it was interesting. So many of the drivers were asked what they thought about Budapest. If you didn't know any better, you'd almost think that they were talking about Austin, because they love to come to Austin, but you get the feeling that they just love to come to Budapest as well. That's cool. The other piece that I would just say, and John, you can probably talk to this better than I can, but the Hungaroring is a short, tight, kind of a bull ring kind of circuit, much like Monaco. So like Monaco, it's difficult to string together a really good lap. It's really difficult to pass. The setups are pretty close or pretty similar. I would suspect it's all about just cramming as much downforce into that car as it possibly can. And we saw it in the race today. It is possible to pass, but you're going to have a superior car. And even then, the guy in front of you is going to have to make a mistake. John, any thoughts?
No, I completely agree with you on that. The only thing I would add is I had a quick look while we were talking. The 1988 McLaren was actually designed by an American engineer, Steve Nichols, and that was,
right.
Yeah. And Gordon Murray was also on the drawing board for that car. So those were two really great guys.
Yeah. You know what? If I'd have been thinking, John Barnard by then was at Ferrari.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, because he was developing the semi-automatic transmission right then. Okay, thanks for clearing that up.
Well, I'm here for you.
No, thank you. Thank you. You know, I had a senior moment. I had a senior moment. So.
Well, our fans our listeners are paying attention to these things, so I want to make sure we get it right as best we can. And
absolutely, and full credit to Steve Nichols.
Yeah, exactly. Great guy, great designer.
Yep.
Well, I think that is a great way to say wonderful conversation, gentlemen. I love how we have each other's backs and try to provide as much information. I started the conversation by saying this race was a bit of a snooze fest to me, but the debrief was not. This brought energy and made me value this race. So we have one more race before summer break. And so I'm looking forward to it because Spa, my goodness, a classic track. And hopefully it will bring some really good highlights and will set us off well for the summer break.
Okay, friends, what did you think about the Hungarian Grand Prix? What did you think about John and Dick's technical discussion about downforce? Would you like to hear us discuss sustainability and F1? Drop me a line via email. Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. Quick programming note. Next week's Belgian Grand Prix conversation will have a delayed release. We'll do our best to get it out as soon as possible. Have you rated and reviewed us in your favorite podcast app yet? If not, please take a moment to do so now. New to the podcast? Check out earlier episodes where John, Dick, and I share our F1 origin stories. Thank you to our followers who are supporting the show. You are making this show possible. John, Dick, and I don't take it for granted. If you're not a member already, check out the Support the Show link in the episode notes. Are you following us on social media? We're in all the usual places. Thanks to those of you who are sending messages and comments. Feedback from you, our listeners, our 2 guys, a girl, and F1 community has been humbling and really encouraging to John, Dick, and me. We know that this is a crowded market, so your words have been and continue to help us build a community and content that we believe in. Thank you. And with that, let me say, that ends this conversation. But rest assured, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.